Thank you so much for coming to our panel. I am Alex, and I'm going to be the chair for this panel, and my co-chair is going to be Anna. So the panel is going to be about recent computational advances in digital behaviorome. And so what do I mean by digital behaviorome? Rather than using the term digital phenotyping, I want it to be more brain specific. And so this is my definition of digital behaviorome. Digital signals of the brain that can be derived from pervasive information technology. But before we start, I first want to take a moment and thank the organizing committee. This is probably the most multidisciplinary conference I've ever attended. Really impressed by the broad range of topics, as everyone who's here today comes from really such diverse background and broad expertise. Computer science, software engineering, mathematics, statistics, and of course, mental health professionals. But on top of that, there are also experts by lived experience in the audience today, including my good friend, retired US Army Major General, Dr. Greg Martin. So the more I thought about this broad range of ways we can use technology in psychiatry, the more I remembered a book that I read recently. It's called Range. For people who haven't read it, the book is about the advantage of broad integration over narrow specialization. Broad integration leads to more innovative way of thinking outside the box, which is otherwise harder to achieve if everyone in the room has the same specialty. So with that, I really want to congratulate the program committee. But on a very personal level, this idea of broad integration also really resonated with me. When I was growing up, I thought I would become either a pure mathematician or a concert pianist. But in a strange twist of events, I became an applied mathematician and a psychiatrist. So for a long time, I have this imposter syndrome, a jack of all trades, but expert of none. It's only very recently that I start to appreciate that all these things come together and gave me the insight that led to this panel. If you remember, in 2015, that's when we started having fitness trackers such as Fitbit and Apple Watch. As a psychiatrist, I was really inspired by having this idea of having a fitness tracker for the human body. So I asked myself, if we can have a fitness tracker for the human body, why can't we have a fitness tracker for the human brain? But how are we going to make a brain fitness tracker? This is where the piano comes into play. Even nowadays, I try to practice piano as much as I can when I'm not traveling. Every time I'm practicing, I'm always noticing that how well I can play the piano is linked to my mood and my concentration for that day. So one day, as I was practicing, I realized that we should, of course, look into the way we use the keyboard on our smartphone. To show you what I mean, imagine as I'm standing here talking to you right now, I also start texting a friend of mine at the same time. Because my attention's divided, my typing rhythm will be variable. I'll be making a lot of typos. And if I'm able to catch my typos, I'll be using the backspace to correct my typos. So with that intuition, we decide to make our own smartphone keyboard, and we put the keyboard on the App Store for everyone to use. If you download the app, you can set the keyboard to replace your standard keyboard every time you are texting a friend, writing an email, or posting on social media, the timing of each key press will be saved so we can understand how fast or slow you're typing, the rhythm of your typing, and the frequency of your backspace and autocorrect events. Then we essentially want to use mathematical models to conduct neuropsychiatric evaluation without actually having to talk to a person. Over the next 80 minutes, we're going to highlight 4 studies that use this bi-affect smartphone keyboard technology. In the first presentation, Michelle will show that your comfortable typing speed when you are not moving around or lying in bed is basically your processing speed. In the second presentation, Mindy will discuss computational methods to analyze both typing speed and triaxial accelerometry during typing. This allows us to do what I called orientational encoding to better understand circadian rhythm. In the third presentation, Loran will talk how he uses orientational encoding and triaxial accelerometry to study chronic suicidality in natural environment. And in the last presentation, Anna will discuss an ongoing study where she's using this technology in the adolescent population. So with that, let's get the party started.
Thank you, Alex, for getting us started. The first presentation will be from Michelle. Unfortunately, she's not able to be here in person, so we're going to see a video of her presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michelle Chen. I am Assistant Professor of Neurology at Rutgers University. For this presentation, I will be discussing characterizing real-world cognitive functioning using the bi-affect platform in multiple sclerosis. Here are my disclosures, and I don't have any conflicts of interest. So for this presentation, I will first provide a brief overview of cognitive impairment in multiple sclerosis or MS, and then I will talk about some of the work we've been doing using bi-affect in the MS population and trying to characterize real-world cognitive impairment. So as a brief overview, MS is a neurodegenerative autoimmune disorder that is characterized by episodes of demyelination and inflammation. And in addition to these episodes of demyelination, there's also brain atrophy that occurs over time. And there is a progression of neurologic disability as the disease advances. And depending on locations of the lesions in the brain and the spinal cord, MS can affect a range of bodily systems, so oftentimes presenting as visual loss, numbness, weakness, gait problems, cognitive impairment, fatigue, emotional changes, and many other symptoms. Specifically regarding cognition, up to 2/3 of persons with MS experience some degree of cognitive impairment. Most commonly affected cognitive domains are processing speed and learning and memory. In addition, executive functioning and visual spatial skills are also affected. Language is typically considered to be relatively spared, although because of the motor problems, the production of language could be affected as well. And existing research has shown correlations between cognitive performance and non-cognitive MS symptoms such as depression, fatigue, and sleep disturbances, but these studies are usually done cross-sectionally, usually from a single laboratory session using neuropsych tests and retrospective self-report inventories. So because of that cross-sectional nature, it's unclear how cognition may vary in real time as a function of disease activity. And specifically, we were interested in whether cognition would fluctuate as non-cognitive symptoms worsens over time. This led to a study that we published recently using ecological momentary assessment. And since we're at TIPS, I think a lot of us are familiar with ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. But in case someone who isn't familiar, EMA is an approach of repeatedly sampling an individual's behavior and experiences in real time within their natural environment. And EMA is advantageous over traditional retrospective self-report because it minimizes recall bias by asking people to report their experiences in real time. And it maximizes ecological validity because we are asking people to report these experiences within their natural environment. So in this study, 45 persons with MS completed 3 EMAs per day for 3 weeks. And in each EMA, they are asked to complete a mobile cognitive task that is an adaptation of the trail making test part B, a measure of executive functioning. And then they're also asked to complete a finger tapping task to characterize their motor speed. And then finally, they are asked to respond to survey questions during each EMA about their overall appraisal of their cognitive functioning, their fatigue, depression, anxiety, and pain levels at that particular time when they're asked, as well as their sleep habits the night before. And because we were interested in how these non-cognitive symptoms can affect cognition, we looked at cognition as the primary endpoint. And the first cognitive outcome that we looked at was the objective measure, which is the mobile trail making test completion time. And from all of the different MS symptoms that we examined, only depression, and specifically state depression, which is when depression is worse than the individual's usual level of depression, that is when we saw a decrement in their performance on the trail making test. When we looked at the subjective cognitive outcome, which is the single question about their cognitive difficulties at the current moment, and then we found that several non-cognitive symptoms were associated with this cognitive outcome, specifically state fatigue, depression, anxiety, and pain, meaning when these symptoms are worse than the individual's usual level, that is when they're also reporting worse cognitive difficulties than usual. And these symptoms really underscore the importance of using EMA because it's really the state symptoms that are associated with cognitive fluctuations, meaning it's only when their symptoms are worse than usual, that's when their cognition was affected. And in fact, the trait aspect of these symptoms, which is the mean level of their symptom severity, was not associated with cognition at all in our analyses. In addition to actually having people perform a cognitive task, we wanted to see whether there's any real-world proxy for cognitive functioning in the real world. And in this case, we wanted to look at whether how people type on their smartphone or keystroke dynamics may tell us something about their cognition. So in this study that we recently published, 16 persons with MS and 10 healthy controls underwent 6 weeks of typing monitoring, where we collected over 1 million keystrokes and 30,000 typing sessions. And when we looked at typing speed, so on this graph, the y-axis is the latency between the key press, the different key presses. So higher values actually refer to slower typing speed. And as you can see, the MS group types significantly slower than the healthy control group. And for the healthy control group, we found that there was actually a speed and accuracy trade-off such that those who type faster, which are those in red, had more typing errors than people who type slower because they were prioritizing speed over accuracy. However, this wasn't really seen with MS because they were already typing slowly to begin with. We also saw that greater use of backspaces were associated with fewer typing errors, suggesting that our hypothesis that when someone's using their backspace, they're really self-monitoring their errors. And this negative correlation is much more prominent in the healthy controls than the MS group, suggesting that persons with MS are less able to engage in that self-monitoring with their typing errors. When we examine the association between keystroke dynamics and cognitive performance on neuropsychological tests, we saw that faster typing speed was associated with better performance on tests of processing speed and executive functioning, indicating convergent validity. And typing speed was not associated with memory, demonstrating divergent validity from memory functions. And then the final set of analyses I wanted to present for this presentation is our comparison of measures of variability and complexity in typing speed. And variability refers to magnitude of fluctuation, so that's usually the dispersion of values around measures of central tendencies. So your measures of variance, standard deviation, coefficient of variation are all measures of variability. And variability measures, usually these traditional measures don't really account for temporal order of data points, where this is where complexity comes in, because it does provide more information on complex systems on top of these conventional measures of variability. Specifically, complexity refers to the irregularity and unpredictability of time series. There's different ways of operationalizing complexity. For this presentation, we're just going to discuss entropy. Just to illustrate the differences between variability and complexity, these are two heart rate time series with almost identical variability measures. As you can see, they have nearly identical mean and standard deviation. So if you just look at those values, they are essentially identical. But when you visually inspect the time series, you'll see that the time series look very different. The top is from a healthy subject, and they are exhibiting a more complex heart rates compared to the one on the bottom, which is a patient during an episode of obstructive sleep apnea, where you can see that their heart rate is much more predictable, and so we would consider that to be less complex. So to characterize complexity, here we are using entropy for our information theory, which is a measure of uncertainty or randomness in a system. So in this case, if we say something has, the time series has high entropy, we're saying that there is a high degree of uncertainty and there's high complexity. And low entropy refers to much more predictable time series and therefore less complexity. And these are the different entropy measures that we examined. On the right here is a graphical representation of sample entropy, which is one of the most commonly used measure of entropy. And this is just kind of a graphical representation of how entropy works. So in sample entropy, you would examine different segments of a time series, and then you look at how repeatable that pattern of that segment is over the course of the time series. So if the same pattern is found throughout the time series, it is considered to be really repeatable. And then you do that with all different segments of the time series to come up with an overall level of entropy. And then if the time series is really repeatable, then we consider it to be low in entropy and low in complexity. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into all the different entropies that are examined here, but they're all similar with some minor variations. So because we wanted to compare variability and complexity, we first look at group differences in variability in typing speed, how variable the typing speed is. And as you can see, the MS group typed much more variably compared to healthy control groups across all these measures of variability. When it comes to cognitive performance, we see that greater variability is associated with worse cognitive performance on this measure of processing speed. When we look at complexity, so in this case entropy, across groups, again, we see a general pattern of the MS group having higher complexity in their typing speed compared to healthy controls. And then when it compares to cognitive performance, we see again that greater complexity is generally associated with worse performance on this processing speed measure. So in summary, real-world cognitive functioning may be negatively impacted by non-cognitive MS symptoms, particularly when depressive symptoms are worse than their usual levels, since state depression was associated with both the objective and subjective cognitive outcome in real time. And smartphone keystroke dynamics may be a proxy for real-world processing speed. So without having people to complete tasks on their phones, we can maybe just infer their processing speed from something that they do normally, which is typing on their smartphones. Specifically, we found that typing speed is slower, more variable, and harder to predict, meaning greater complexity among persons with MS. And greater variability and complexity in typing speed is associated with worse processing speed performance that was administered at baseline. So overall, there is definitely a lot of promise for using keystroke dynamics as a real-world characterization of someone's processing speed. And the next steps in this line of research is really trying to examine real-time correspondence between typing speed and mobile cognitive task performance. So thank you for listening to this presentation. I definitely would like to acknowledge Dr. Alex Leow and her team for thank you for inviting me, as well as really helping me with these studies that I presented to you today. And also want to acknowledge all of my collaborators, my students and staff, as well as funding sources that help produce these the results that I was sharing with you today. Thank you.
I think we have some time for Q&A. If anyone wants to ask questions,
I have just maybe a general question. I was trying to stand back a little bit. That's pretty loud. So this kind of relates to a combination of the first two talks. The typing dynamics are really fascinating, and sort of the positional nature, kind of the way that you're thinking about this behavioral aspect of what people are doing. How are you thinking about how the use of phones might be changing over time? So certainly there's a lot of typing usage, but now there's sort of speech-to-text options. Are you thinking about using that information? And because I know there are people who have studied sort of prosody and intonation to kind of infer mood. And so do you have sort of a thought of stepwise integration of whether it might enhance prediction, or over time are you thinking that some features you might discard, others might be more useful in combination with other measures?
All right, I guess I can answer that question. Yes, so that's actually a great comment. I think we are in a very, in my opinion, very interesting time in psychiatry, is that we have all these wonderful tools, but also these tools are dependent on the current state of where the technology is at. So we have to constantly evolve. And what you were saying earlier about whether, in addition to text input, whether there's speech to text or other ways of looking at prosody or the speech pattern analysis. We are looking to that. It's not part of this. I think when we were starting out, we were probably one of the first to look into keyboard dynamics. So we really want to do something that was complementary to what others were doing. But I have some interesting conversations lined up for today, actually, and we're going to be talking about some NLP analyses, actually. So, yeah.
Hi. So this kind of goes for everyone working on therapeutics and digital tracking and that sort of thing, but how do you imagine using this in the future, whether it be for clinical trials or real world with patients? And how do you think about engagement with the clinicians or whoever is actually using that data? Because engagement tends to be kind of the problem in this space, right?
So I'll take a stab at this one. I think part of what's appealing about these approaches from the patient perspective is that it doesn't actually require a lot of engagement. So in Michelle's talk, she mentioned using ecological momentary assessment, which is great for getting a lot of data, but you find that over time, patients or participants typically stop responding, so it's good for short term. Whereas I think these approaches are more passive, and so you can monitor people for a longer period of time, and I'll be talking about that some in my talk. I think in terms of the clinician side of it, it's essential that these tools are integrated with the workflow that already exists. So if we ask people to look at a separate dashboard or get an email or something like that, it's not going to be actionable for the most part because clinicians are completely overwhelmed with their current responsibilities. So I think integrating into the electronic health records, whatever the clinicians are already doing, making this information available to them through that is crucial.
So one of the critical pieces in all of this is what are the psychometric or what are the measurement properties of these keystroke measures. So have you done extensive test-retest reliabilities, and do you know what the test-retest reliability is? Because for any longitudinal assessment of this, you need to know how reliable these measures really are.
Yes, another wonderful comment. So yes, we've been looking into that. Some of the results that we published recently, we didn't have time to include those analyses, but one of the things we've noticed early on that we didn't talk about is that because you're able to collect so much data within a person and also across different days in the same day, one thing you've noticed is that typing speed or typing dynamics actually exhibit very distinct diurnal pattern. So we see that when we first wake up in the morning, our typing performance doesn't really peak until after a couple of hours after you wake up. So it's usually, maybe for me, it's a cup of coffee. And then once that typing performance reaches its peak, then it gradually drops towards the end of the day. So we really see that sort of sensitivity or susceptibility to some kind of circadian rhythm. Interestingly, we see that the older you get, the stronger this susceptibility is. But yes, we are looking into the validity of these measures, but I think going back to what I was talking about earlier, what I'm most excited about is that using technology opens up a brand new way for us to think about these questions. Maybe there are new ways for us to understand what do we really mean by having a measurement validity when we're talking about the pervasive technology. And all these are, basically brand new ideas that we have to tackle in the future.
Sure. I mean, I don't disagree with that, but if you're trying to look at an intervention or some characteristic or relationship to mood, you got to know what the test-retest reliability is, and if it is state dependent as you just described, then it's probably not very high.
Yes, thank you.
Hi. One thing through our own trials that kind of came up is the thought of when users have different phone sizes themselves, how do you kind of account for that, algorithmically? Because then there's just the distance between keyboards can be higher between each key.
Yes, so that's one of the things that we control for, and then also by looking within subject, we just take out that factor.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm curious, did you sample subjects to see if there were periods where they were more maybe typing faster when they were annoyed, for example, and what did you see from that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
People, if their typing speeds mattered with how they felt, so if they're annoyed or I don't know, fighting with someone? Did they type faster or slower? Those kind of things.
Yeah, so that's something definitely to look into.
So I'm intrigued with your definition of cognition, because a lot of what you're saying is how it blah, 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 and it relates to improved cognition or changes in cognition. But my experience has been cognition is a very complex concept involving a lot of abstract reasoning and other multimodal things. And it looked to me, just from this brief presentation, that you were talking about cognition in such a limited way, like finger tracing or processing speed, which again, you're only using the technology. They're not actually like explaining things, or, you know what I mean?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
so we got the question? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, so right now, I focus firstly on looking at executive functioning that is otherwise measured with the trail making test. Right now, we're also looking into things like response inhibition, but we have yet to cover the whole breadth of cognition.
It's a large scope.
Yes, very large.
You are just starting at the tip.
Yes.
Yeah, the data's amazing.
Alex, really very interesting presentation. Who else is up there with BioFact doing this same type of work?
So again, I think we are always growing our team. You know, something I didn't talk about earlier was that when I first started doing this back in 2015, I think most people thought that this is science fiction than science. So I feel like we are working very hard to advance, and now I think we are demonstrating that there is some science here. It's more than science fiction. And as someone commented earlier, we think that this is really just, you know, I think something like this can lead to a brand new way for us to think about how we could understand human behavior in a natural environment. And I think it becomes a very orthogonal, very complementary way compared to the more in-person, traditional in-person, in lab, in scanner kind of assessment. But we are always looking for collaborators. There are some other collaborators we were hoping to pull in, but again, because of time constraint. But thank you for that comment. If you are interested, if you are passionate about something like this, we'd love to chat with you. Thank you.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that. So I'll give a plug for, we're going to hear from Apple's Marnie Bartlett later today, who's going to talk about SensorKit. And SensorKit actually is a set of features that they've engineered with help from the academic community, including keyboard dynamics. So anyone who's interested in this topic, SensorKit is something that you can add to any app, you know, iPhone-based app if you want to collect these kinds of data, and it generates features not unlike what they're talking about here. So the idea there is to generate you know, much larger data sets through SensorKit. So, yeah.
So I think we're going to have one last question, then we probably should
So for BioEffect, it seems like all of this was done in English. Do you have ideas about expanding to other languages, especially languages with more complicated diacritical marks or broader alphabets, smaller alphabets? How would you adjust to sort of understand that? Do you think that the correlations would be similar?
Yes, another wonderful comment. So when we were starting out, we were really, as far as I know, we were one of probably 2 different universities looking at something like this. And so we develop our own auto-suggest, we develop our own autocorrect. Everything is done in-house. And so it's a lot of work, because if you want to do this in a different language, you can imagine. But we have some ideas. We're also, you know, always looking for potentially commercial partners. But another wonderful, wonderful comment. I think that's another reason why every time I get to speak about this, I want to hopefully raise awareness, and hopefully more people are passionate, and hopefully we can all work together, add more language support, different languages, additional sensors, SensorKit, as Justin was talking about. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, so I think with that,
All right, well, thank you. So my name is Loran Knol. I'm from the Dundas Institute, from the university, the Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. And today I'll talk to you about sensor fusion using independent component analysis in suicidal ideation. So before I continue, a trigger warning. This talk discusses themes related to suicide. If that triggers you in any way, feel free to leave and come back in about 20 minutes. But otherwise, I'll just continue right now. So I want to zoom out a bit again, because the overall goal of BioAffect is kind of to make this tight integration between behavior, which we usually measure by keyboard dynamics in this case, clinical data, such as disorders, and biology, which can be, for instance, brain measurements or anything else. So in the end, we want to integrate all of those three factors, but for this talk, I will mainly focus on the bottom relationship with a special role for accelerometry and EMA data as well, as Michelle already explained. And to investigate this relationship more closely, we'll be making use of the CLEAR-3 data set. The CLEAR-3 trial is being run by Troy Eisenlower Mol, which you can see up there, and it is a randomized crossover trial investigating suicidal ideation surrounding menstruation. So some of you might know, some women experience an increase in psychological issues surrounding menses, with an increase in suicidal ideation being one of them. This has to do with certain hormones withdrawing from the body surrounding menses, and by re-administering those hormones, possibly we can diminish the amount of suicidal ideation. In our case, we used the baseline data of this study, so no intervention was being done at that time yet, and participants were required to answer to 34 self-report items on a daily basis, and were given the option to opt into BioAffect and use that all throughout the day. So you can already see that we're dealing with a very highly densely phenotyped and highly clinical sample of high quality. Our release of the data set included 104 participants, and 55 of those used BioAffect on a daily basis. So I want to go a bit more into the self-report items and what they actually consist of. We have, for instance, better not alive. I thought it would be better if I was not alive. Or people on nerves, or the people were getting on my nerves. And these two questions and all the others came from 6 different questionnaires, and participants could answer using 5 or 6 point Likert scales, such as completely disagree or fully agree. So while analyzing these data, we encountered a couple of challenges that we had to address. The first challenge being the one of temporal alignment. So I want to focus your attention on the figure on the right there. It shows 3 different data modalities, and over a short time frame of about 25 seconds. The first data modality on the top, self-report, shows 1 single data point, because we only ask for self-report data once per day. Meanwhile, below that, the keyboard modality shows many more samples for this short time frame, because people, of course, type multiple times a day, and also whenever they want to. So you can already see that this sampling frequency is also very irregular. Then below that, we have an even denser modality, namely the accelerometer modality, because as soon as you start typing, the accelerometer activates and starts collecting data at 10 hertz, so 10 times a second. So you can see that we have very different sampling frequencies across the board, also some of them very irregular, and it's not immediately clear how we can align these things in the best way to create some sensible models out of them. Another challenge would be the challenge of high dimensionality. So in this case, we would like to predict the self-report data from the BioAffect data, but we're dealing with 34 different questions over perhaps months. So it's really a very high-dimensional prediction problem, which is something that also needs to be addressed if we want to do this effectively. So to solve these challenges, we've developed our own integrated solution consisting of 3 different steps. The first one being temporal independent component analysis. Temporal ICA, for short, takes in a matrix of time series. So in this case, we have on the y-axis the self-reports item ratings, and on the x-axis we have time. And then we simply stack all these time series on top of each other to get a matrix. And that is what we feed to the temporal ICA. and then temporal ICA takes this matrix and factorizes it into two different matrices. On the left, we have a mixing matrix, and on the right, we have an independent component matrix. The mixing matrix specifies how much every generated independent component contributes to the original self-report item measure. So every value in this matrix is basically specifies how much that component has contributed to that self-report item measure, and we call these values loadings. On the right-hand side, we have these generated independent components themselves, which have been generated by maximizing their statistical independence over time. So what is crucial to note here is that the time domain is being kept intact, and that we have less independent components than we had original item measures, effectively leading to dimensionality reduction. In our case, we took 34 self-report items and reduced them to 5 components. Doesn't need to be 5, can be anything else, but for the sake of argument, we're going with 5 here. The next step is relatively simple. We simply aggregate the data to the lowest temporal resolution. So in that case, that is the daily level. So also for the keyboard dynamics and for the accelerometer data, we get daily aggregate measurements. That makes our next step a bit simpler, which is creating mixed effects models to predict the time course of the independent components from the bioeffect features. So which bioeffect features did we use? I'll walk you through them. Let's put them in a vector called X. There's the median interkey delay, as Mindy already explained. So that's an inverse measure of typing speed. The 95th percentile of the interkey delay, a measure of pausing while typing. There's the mean absolute deviation of the interkey delay, which is a measure of typing speed variability. And there are things like autocorrect rates, backspace rates, total number of key presses, movement rates, so how much the phone moves while typing, measured by the accelerometer, and upright rate. This was the orientational encoding that was referred to earlier. Then we take this vector of bioeffect features and we plug it into our formula for the mixed effects models. And I'll also walk you through this formula. On the left-hand side, we have a time point from an independent component time course. And then on the right-hand side, we have both fixed effects and random effects. So beta 0 is our fixed intercept, and beta 1 will be the coefficients for our bioeffect feature vector. And then we have a couple of random intercepts, namely the participant level random intercepts, because of course we're doing repeated measures, every participant is different, so it makes sense to include a specific intercept for every participant. Then there is a weak within participant level random intercept, because my week could be very different from yours. Your week could have been brilliant, but my week could have been a particularly bad one. And also we're dealing with menstrual cycle data. Not everybody's menstrual cycle is aligned, of course, so it makes sense to include week-specific offsets for people's independent components. Then at the very end, at the right-hand side, we have the day within week within participant error term. So with the entire pipeline specified, I now would like to take a look at the results. And for that, we'll be looking at the mixing matrix first of the independent component analysis, because the mixing matrix specifies the link between the original item measures and the generated independent components. So here we go. It's a big figure, and I'll walk you through it. On the left-hand side, we have the self-report items, some examples of which I gave earlier. For instance, Better Not Alive is there on top. And I know that some of you are currently trying to read the very tiny font at the left-hand side, so please stop doing that and start listening to me again. We've color-coded the self-report items according to which questionnaire they came from. So we have the adult suicidal ideation questionnaire on top, then the brief agitation measure, the brief irritability test, the daily record of severity of problems, the interpersonal needs questionnaire, some items from a prior study, miscellaneous, and the positive and negative effect schedule. Then on the x-axis, we have the loading values. So remember, these values specify how much every generated independent component contributes to the generated or to the original self-report item measures. And then on top, we have a separate column per independent component. So I would like to draw your attention to the first independent components column, where we can see that we have negative loadings, relatively small negative loadings on all items that are also emotionally negative, and relatively large positive loadings on all the items that are emotionally positive, leading us to call this item the well-being component. Then the second component has a pattern that is somewhat reversed. So we have small negative loadings on the emotionally positive variables and positive loadings on the emotionally negative variables. And what stands out the most is that we have quite large positive loadings on, you can't see it right now, but that is anhedonia, lack of motivation, and a lack of interest. So this leads us to call this component the anhedonia component. The other components are also interesting to look at, but for the sake of time, I will not go into them right now. What is most interesting to note is that our mixed effects models predicted a significant effect of phone movement on anhedonia, in that less phone movement is associated with more anhedonia, so stronger intensity of component 2. This also was so robust that it survived very strict multiple comparison corrections. We found a nominally significant effect of phone movement on the well-being component 2, in that more phone movement was associated with more well-being, but this effect was not strong enough to survive the strict multiple comparison correction. So there we are. We have been able to extract interpretable components from the self-report EMA data, and we have been able to successfully use the mixed effects models to predict their time course from the by-effect features. So with that being said, I would like to go forward and look at some of the future directions that we can head into. One of those things will be inferring chronotypes. So this is something that Alex has already referenced to just now, because we know that people will tend to type slower during the night and the early morning and speed up during the afternoon. And this effect is also mediated by age. We found this for the group level, but we would also like to infer this on an individual level. So we're currently developing models that can take into account this oscillatory behavior and predict that for the individual. So in this plot, we have the median interkey delay on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And the predictions of our model are basically the blue line that goes for all the data points. And if we zoom in on this thing, then we can see that we have the highest interkey delay, so the slowest typing at the very start of the day, so that is about 12 a.m., and the lowest interkey delay during the afternoons. So with that, we can extract the intensity of this variation for a specific individual, and perhaps also quantify whether that's going to drift away from the individual's own baseline, which might correspond to a change in clinical or mental well-being. Another natural thing to look into is sleep prediction. So this is something that Mindy has been working on extensively. These are plots that give you, on the y-axis, the day number, and on the x-axis, the hour of the day. And given that we know that when people type, and also that there is diurnal variation in typing speed, it makes sense to combine that information to predict how much people are actually sleeping. So we apply something called the graph regularized singular value decomposition to get a measure of typing intensity, cluster that into sleep and wake labels, count the number of sleep labels, and then use that information to predict how much people sleep, so we can compare that to what people actually reported they slept. And for some participants, we get a correlation between these measures that's actually quite good. Finally, I want to circle back to our original goal. So we want to make this tight integration between behavior, clinical symptoms, and biology. So at the University of Illinois at Chicago, we are already working on this. We are trying to integrate this connectome, so the connectomics of the brain with the behaviorome, through something that is called the unobtrusive monitoring of affective symptoms and cognition using keyboard dynamics or a mask study. So we're also using aura ring. We're not only using bi-effect or accelerometry, but also aura ring for the behavior parts, and then MRI for the biology part. So we're working on getting the entire picture together. Some of the key takeaways: we have attempted harmonization of heterogeneous data types and, in my opinion, succeeded. We've seen that temporal ICA extracts interpretable components from self-report data, and we have seen that mixed effects models were able to fuse them together with the typing data. We've also seen that typing accelerometry predicts anhedonia in the suicidal sample, and that more phone movement leads to less anhedonia. These are my contact details. These are QR codes to the preprint and my code on GitHub. And I'm now open to taking questions. I see that my presentation was very clear. Oh, yeah.
So this is a maybe generic question for a lot of the work that you all have presented so far, and it's very good. Thank you for presenting it. There's a tension when we have really high dimensional measures that are high frequency measures as well, to want to know how to translate those measures into constructs that we can convey easily in natural language, and with the likely reality that some of the high dimensionality itself retains predictive value. And so I was wondering if you've thought about using more unsupervised feature selection methods for prediction, basically jettisoning the desire to be able to translate the constructs initially and just say, do these things predict the outcomes that we're interested in? If we, for example, think about taking all these data vectors and embedding them into some higher dimensional space, and then using that, some type of attention mechanism over that embedding to do a prediction, basically some type of LSTM or something like that. And then the biggest question being, what kind of accuracy can we do predicting the outcomes that we're interested in psychiatry? And then if we do have high accuracy, can we go back in and dig in and find constructs that seem to be producing that at the core of it? So that's a more general question, but it seems related to this too.
Thank you. Yeah, it's an amazing question. So in this specific case, for instance, temporal independent component analysis, of course, you're stuck with the fact that you have to specify the number of independent components that you want. So in reality, I simply do sensitivity analyses to look at, what is useful, which components still remain interpretable even after going to very high dimensions. Having this being automated would be amazing, I think. So this is something that we have not worked on that much yet. Usually when we try to predict, for instance, depression or anything, we've used one or two scores, for instance, the Hamilton Depression Score and the Young Mania Rating Score. Yeah, I think that would be a very interesting direction for future research, but it's not something that I know that we have done as of yet, but perhaps you have something to add?
Yes, so that's, again, another wonderful comment. So we are leaving out sort of the key press level analyses that we've been doing. We're happy to talk about that offline. We have an idea of repurposing sequence-to-sequence attention mechanism, transformer model. We're doing that right now. It's very preliminary, but there are some other even more interesting, lesser known deep learning architecture that we are looking into. I think there are some other existing limitations in the current, even transformer model is ultimately a sequence to sequence, doesn't take into the timing into account, so yes.
Awesome, thanks again.
I'll just add one thing to the point about the last question. I think another important consideration is the buy-in from people about these approaches. And so I think starting with factors that are face valid and that can be explained to patients or clinicians is important, and that other approaches that might be less interpretable will be a future step. All right, so thank you all for your attention and for being here. We have a youth mental health crisis in this country that's been very well publicized. And one of the things that exacerbates the consequences of the increasing prevalence of anxiety, depression, and suicide risk among youth in this country is the fact that we don't have enough clinicians who are trained specifically to work with young people. And even among youth who are engaged in services, misdiagnosis and suboptimal treatment are very common. One of the reasons for this is that in psychiatry, we rely primarily on self-report to make our diagnoses and to make our predictions about what we expect to happen for our patients in the future. Self-report is subjective. The way that our patients describe their symptoms or interpret what's going on with them is different than we might do. And when you're working with young people, it's more complicated because you have the parent report and you have the child report. They rarely agree, and you have to rely on your clinical judgment to understand what to do with those discrepancies. So when our diagnosis or our prediction about the trajectory of somebody's illness is wrong, it's unlikely that the treatment that we prescribe is going to best meet their needs. Adolescence is a period of time when an individual is most likely to experience the onset of a mental health disorder. It's also a really critical developmental period during which people are setting up the foundations for their personal and their professional lives. If they're symptomatic during this time and not getting the treatment that they need, it's going to be difficult for them to achieve a high quality of life later on as an adult. And for me, minimizing this gap between when somebody first experiences symptoms and when they get the best treatment for them is a primary motivating factor in my career. And I think that digital phenotyping and the type of data that we've been describing could be a great way to infuse some objective data to address this challenge. We can learn a lot about an individual's behavior and their sort of typical patterns from data from their smartphones. So using myself as an example, if we were to collect my digital phenotype, we might learn that my phone tends to lock and sit stable and flat around 11 o'clock at night, and it stays that way for several hours. Based on my GPS system, you could infer where I live because during those hours when I'm sleeping, that's where I probably am. You could also figure out where I work, how many different locations I tend to go to each day, how physically active I am, how social I am. And if you looked at my phenotype and compared it to other people, you might see that working professionals have similarities in their digital phenotypes. And then if you compared that to another type of person, perhaps a college student, it might look very different, where a college student gets up different times each day depending on their class schedule, might stay up all night cramming for a test, might have a more limited geographic footprint where they sort of study and socialize all in the same campus. Now, distinguishing between a working professional and a college student isn't really very useful, but within psychiatry, if we were able to collect digital phenotype data from a potential patient before an intake, we could then look at their data and say, does this look more similar to a digital phenotype from somebody with depression or anxiety or perhaps bipolar disorder? And I don't think we would use this information alone to make a diagnosis, but it's important objective data that could inform the diagnostic process. Another big challenge in psychiatry, as I mentioned earlier, is predicting what somebody's course of illness is going to be like so that we can adjust treatment accordingly. And I think that digital phenotyping also has a lot of potential here. We talked earlier about EMA or different survey approaches that one might use to get information about people in between their appointments. But those don't tend to be something that we can practically use over a long term. And if somebody has a chronic mental health disorder, we need to be tracking them for years, not weeks. And I think most clinicians have had the experience of meeting with a patient, thinking they're doing relatively well, sort of sending them on their way, and then finding out at the next appointment that that person's mental health has significantly deteriorated, or even that they've been hospitalized. And it would be nice if we could have more information so that we could intervene prior to that patient experiencing the consequences of that deterioration. And in some work, we've seen that anomalies in people's digital phenotype data do correspond to relapse. So in this particular study, they found that across mobility, sociability, they found differences that corresponded to relapse about 2 weeks in the future. One thing to me that's really exciting about this is that 2 weeks is a very clinically actionable amount of time. So that's enough time that you could actually reach out to that patient, to their caregiver, and try to do something for them. Another thing that I'm really enthusiastic about with this approach is that smartphone data collection can improve equity in mental health services. Across adolescents, smartphone ownership is pretty ubiquitous. So we see across gender, racial, and ethnic categories, different socioeconomic groups, and parental level of education, almost 100% of adolescents own a smartphone. And in this study, they collapsed different cohorts of adults who had participated in digital phenotyping studies, and they found that the level of missingness in the data did not correspond with sociodemographic characteristics, suggesting that this is a way that we can get information about patients without introducing a lot of bias. We also know that adolescents and caregivers are comfortable providing access to their phone sensor data in a mental health context. This is a question that I often get asked, do families actually let you track their young people in this way? And in my experience, they do when you explain to them the type of data that we're collecting and how it's going to be used. However, there are actually very, very few studies using digital phenotyping in young people. This graph is from a review article that was looking at digital phenotyping and health broadly, not specific to mental health. But there were only 7 studies that included anybody under the age of 20, and only 4 of those included any adolescents. So I'm going to describe to you 2 studies that are currently being conducted using digital phenotyping in adolescents and trying to address some of these big clinical challenges that we face. The first is the digital phenotype of bipolar disorder. We have 2 primary aims in this study. The first is to describe the digital phenotype of bipolar disorder in adolescents and to determine whether that digital phenotype looks different from typically developing adolescents. Bipolar disorder is one of the most difficult mental health disorders to accurately diagnose. And on average, people will go 10 years from when they first seek services until they get an accurate diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And so if we are able to find distinct attributes of the digital phenotype of bipolar disorder in young people, that could do a lot to reduce that period of time. The second goal is to see whether the digital phenotype data correspond with clinically significant changes in the mood and behavior of our participants. So in order to address this aim, we are collecting the digital phenotype from our bipolar group and the typically developing group. And we're also talking with our participants and their caregivers once a month for 18 months. So we have a gold standard clinical assessment as well as the digital phenotype data. And our hope is that the digital phenotype data will correspond with changes that we're observing in our clinical assessments. And if that's the case, moving forward, we would hope that we could rely just on the digital phenotype data for monitoring without having to have adolescents come to frequent appointments that can be burdensome and expensive. This is an ongoing study, but we have about 50 participants who have completed their 18-month participation. We have a very diverse sample, and our rates of completion are very high. So it's an 18-month study, and on average, our participants stay with it for 16 months, which I think speaks to the fact that this is a useful tool over long term. We do collect surveys from our participants 3 times a week. They take about a minute to complete. They're very low burden as far as this goes, but we see that the survey completeness falls precipitously over the course of the study. So again, not a great way to monitor people long term. In contrast, the passive data remain complete across the 18-month study period, and we don't see any differences in our typically developing group and our bipolar group in terms of the completeness of the data. So to me, this shows that digital phenotyping is a feasible approach. Now to look at some descriptive differences in our 2 groups. What you see on the left side is a graph of screen lock-unlock status. So each time a participant locks or unlocks their phone, a black dot goes on the graph. So in our adolescents with bipolar disorder, you can see they're extremely active on their phones. And one thing I want to point out is that between the hours of 12 a.m. and 6 a.m., when we might expect most people to be asleep, there remains a lot of phone activity. So there isn't really a distinction between daytime and nighttime for these participants. In contrast, when you look at the typically developing adolescents, you can see right away that they're less active on their phones in general, and that during that 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. time, they don't tend to be on their phones, they're sleeping. So these data correspond with what we would expect to see clinically, which is that adolescents with bipolar disorder have a lot of sleep disturbances and that their sleep patterns look different from typically developing adolescents. In our data, we also see that with in-person, GPS data relates to depression. So people who go more places tend to be less depressed in the future. Similarly, people who have more variability in their activities and are doing more different things also tend to be less depressed in the future. So these data are very preliminary, but I think show a lot of potential, and I'm excited to see, what we'll find when the study wraps up next year. The next study that I want to talk a little bit about is addressing another significant challenge, which is predicting suicide risk in young people. Unfortunately, over the past 15 years or so, we've seen an increase in rates of suicidal ideation, attempt, and death in this country. And this is despite the fact that significant resources have been dedicated to trying to prevent suicide in this population. And I think one of the reasons that we may not have made much progress in reducing suicide in this cohort is that a lot of the risk factors that have been studied are looking far in the future. So who's at risk for suicide a year from now or 5 years from now? And that's important to know, but it's not clinically actionable. As a clinician, I want to know who's at risk this week or next week. Do they need to be hospitalized? Do I need to do something to keep them safe? Among the risk factors that have been measured in a shorter term is cognition. So we know that young people who engage in suicidal behaviors tend to be more impulsive and have poorer cognitive control than their peers, and that the association of impulsivity and poor cognitive control with suicide risk increases the closer you measure them in proximity. So in this study, our goal is to see if using bi-affect, which we've learned can be a great way of measuring cognition, we can predict in the short term who is at risk for increasing intensity or frequency of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So we're recruiting adolescents who have a recent history of suicidal thoughts and/or attempt. In addition to having them use the bi-affect keyboard, we're also asking them every day via text message whether or not they've had any suicidal thoughts, how intense those thoughts have been, and whether or not they've engaged in any suicidal behaviors. So similar to the previous study I described, our goal is to see, do the bi-affect data help us to predict who is going to indicate that they've experienced an increase in the intensity of their suicide urges? We're also talking with the adolescents and their caregiver once a month over a 3-month study period to assess any other changes in their mood or their behavior that might inform our risk model. So I think based on the other presentations that we've heard this morning, this study also has a lot of potential, and I'm excited to see what we find. And if we are able to make predictions with some level of accuracy, I think one of the great things that will support is the use of just-in-time interventions. So when we collect these data digitally, if we can analyze them in real time, we can deliver an intervention at the point that we're assessing the risk. So others have done this previously, and the way that it can work is if somebody is assessed to be having passive suicidal ideation, for example, they might get a message encouraging them to call a suicide hotline or with a supportive message. If somebody's indicating that they have active suicidal ideation but no plan or intent, perhaps a suicide hotline could reach out to them. If somebody seems to be at more imminent risk, we could even get to the point of sending emergency services to them. So I think there's a lot of potential here to try to help keep people safe. All of these studies are sort of in their infancy. This approach is very new, and that makes it exciting, but I think there are a lot of questions still to be addressed. And some of the ones that I've been thinking about are how much data are required to quantify somebody's digital phenotype? Do we need to follow someone for a year to understand what patient category they belong in? And if so, that's not really useful. But if we could get that information from a week or 2 weeks, that would be. Related, we need to figure out what's the most parsimonious data collection that we can do. In research, we tend to collect as much as possible. But if we want to take this into clinics, they don't have the capacity to pay for storing huge amounts of data or the resources to analyze that data in real time. So we need to figure out what's the least amount of data that we can collect to make the predictions that we care about. We also need to figure out how far in advance these data can help us to predict a clinically significant change. As I mentioned already, if it's a year from now, that's not that useful. If it's 5 minutes from now, that's not that useful. We need to try to see what's the sweet spot where we can do something to help prevent consequences. And then finally, what are the safeguards that we need to put in place to make sure that these data are managed ethically? So that, of course, includes data privacy and security, but also if we hold information that tells us about somebody's risk for suicide or hospitalization, what are our responsibilities for acting on that information? All right, so just to close, thank you all for your attention. Thanks to my lab and my collaborators.
Hi, thanks for a very interesting presentation. I was struck by the data that you showed in the first study of the screen locks. And it kind of reminded me a little bit of when you look at functional imaging data at a group level and you sort of see a cluster or clusters of activation and you start to kind of try to impute or figure out what does this mean. And I was also struck by, I think, the pragmatic goal of trying to relate some of this data to symptoms, right, in a very actionable way. So you showed a regression that was like GPS locations in relation to depression symptoms, but have you tried simpler measures like number of openings, screen unlockings relating to measures of mania or discrete symptoms like irritability, restlessness, things like that, that would maybe not, you couldn't necessarily tie one to the other causally, but at least could give you some sort of pragmatic inference about the state of the individual from day to day.
We have not done that, but that's definitely a goal. I mean, related to the parsimony thing, the screen lock unlock status is way easier to collect and understand than GPS data, which is very complicated. The analyses that I showed are based more on specific individuals' interests, that we've sort of gotten a head start on those analyses, but that will definitely be part of the main outcomes of the study.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
This is also a bit more of a general question and quickly gets into ethical things as well, but especially given that, you know, we're monitoring and collecting so much data based on a keyboard, is there a temptation or a vision to somehow also use the content of what is being typed, whether it's emojis, especially with an adolescent population? I feel like there would be a lot of information just based on what emoji that teen is using the most, or classes of words like die, things related to mortality, suicide, etc.
I'll say one thing and then turn it over to Alex. So I think part of what appeals to the families that I work with is that we're not necessarily looking at the specifics of what they're doing, like the actual words or who they're communicating with, things like that. I have been involved in other projects where we analyze social media posts or other types of data that are exactly what you're describing, and I think that's much more sensitive and has more ethical implications, even in terms of how people might censor themselves or change their behaviors because they feel like they're being observed by a clinician or some other entity.
So that's a really wonderful comment, and that's actually a lot of our internal discussions about where the technology is at and where we want to go actually revolved around those topics. But I think you were saying earlier, I think as mental health professionals, I think it's so important for us to consider the ethics. But on the other hand, we know for a fact that everything we do is being mined by Google and by Apple, and there's ChatGPT. So I think there's some sense of urgency that we as researchers, we need to do something in this space. But I think we need to really put our heads together and figure out the right way to do it.
So I'd like to just follow up on that comment just about companies monitoring and mining everything that everyone is doing. So I'll be giving a talk later from Apple. And so Apple, I can say for sure, is not collecting people's activity data and their fitness data. It stays locked on your phone. And the only way it's collected is when someone participates in a study and they authorize sharing on a data type by data type level basis, and they can see it on their phone, they can see who's getting the data, and they can turn it off.
Thank you so much for that comment. Actually, I don't know if I misspoke earlier, but you know, one of the primary reasons why we, when we're implementing this, we went with Apple is because we believe it's a much more secure system. And because of the kind of data we're collecting, we really want to make sure that the system is secure. So thank you for that. Really appreciate it.
Once again, fantastic talk. So again, I have another more general question. So all the research shown this morning has been fantastic for showing the ability to use digital phenotyping to be able to predict these risk factors. But I'm also interested in doing the opposite. Like, can we do digital phenotype if people have more social support or these changes that have more positive impacts, not just in terms of not conveying these specific disorders, but just doing a bit more general well-being?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a goal that some projects are working on. I'm involved in a study at NYU involving employees and healthcare worker burnout. And so we're collecting digital phenotype data, among other things, to try to better understand factors that lead to poor well-being in employees. And I think another great potential use for this type of approach is in treatment response or other, like, more support, things that you might do to intervene to improve somebody's status that can also be measured this way.
I guess more specifically with adolescents, like if you have any measures from the family that show closeness with children, the level of family support that they feel outside of the specific disorders of suicide risk, it'd be interesting if that in general has a marker, because both if you're doing family-wise approaches or if things just kind of shift positively, being able to track what specific things kind of help this individual is almost as important for what specific things kind of hurt this individual.
Yeah, and it could tell us more about resilience or what puts people at risk for mental health disorders in the future, so we can try to bolster more resilience in the people who are at risk.
Thank you so much.
Terrific talk. Going back to your comment on bipolar disorder, taking 10 years to diagnose. So my bipolar disorder took 11 years from onset to correct diagnosis. But looking back now with what I know, I don't really understand why it was so hard to diagnose. I mean, 3 times over a period of years, I went in with serious depression. I knew there was something wrong with me because I'm normally either hyperthymic or manic. So that's my personality type. So I'm always energetic, always up, super motivated, drive, etc. So when I went into the doctor and said, hey, I am really depressed, there's something wrong with me, it doesn't seem like it should have been that hard for the doctors to reach out to my work colleagues, my family or something, and get kind of a baseline that I'm normally hyperthymic, manic, hypomanic, but nothing like that was done. So I was misdiagnosed. They just said, hey, you're fine. And then it took all the way to the 11-year mark when I was in, full-blown mania and was ordered by my commander to go to the hospital and get checked. And so then I was even in full-blown mania, and they said, you're fine, there's nothing wrong with you. And then finally, several months later, I went into just, terrible, terrible depression and psychosis, went into the hospital myself, and they finally diagnosed me correctly. So why is it so hard to diagnose?
Well, I think there's a lot of stigma or bias even among clinicians and also lack of experience. So most people who work in psychiatry don't actually have many opportunities to work with people who have bipolar disorder. And I think that there's this sense that bipolar disorder is very obvious. People kind of have this picture in their mind of someone who is floridly manic and doing like a beautiful mind type thing. And in my experience working with people with bipolar disorder, that almost never is the case. And so I think clinicians are looking for something that doesn't really exist in the real world. And depending on when somebody comes for treatment, that influences a lot the type of assessment the clinician is doing. So if you initially came when you were depressed and they asked, oh, you're feeling depressed, let me inquire about all your depressive symptoms, and then you end up with a diagnosis of depression because people don't think to or don't have the time and resources to inquire with other people in your life to ask like, hey, have you ever felt too good? Have you ever been way more productive than you typically are? They don't ask about that. And I think too, I'm assuming that you're a very high functioning person, and so if people are able to keep functioning despite their symptoms, I think again clinicians think like, well, it couldn't be bipolar disorder then. It's a real problem.
Okay, thank you.
So I think in the interest of time, I think it's a good way for us to end this on a high note. I really appreciate everyone coming today. I think we had a wonderful panel. Thank you.